Today, we're asking a pretty fundamental question, one that might just shift how you see the world stage. What if a lot of what we, in the West, assume about a rising global power? What if it's based on, well, misunderstandings, false assumptions even?
That's exactly what we're getting into. We're taking a really deep dive into Michael Pillsbury's book, The 100-Year Marathon, China's secret strategy to replace America as the global superpower. It's certainly an influential text.
Right. How does China's leadership, according to Pillsbury at least, view its own story, past, present, and future?
And the core of it, the central thesis, is this idea of a 100-year plan. Meticulously crafted, he argues, rooted in ancient Chinese strategy, all aimed at surpassing the U.S. by 2049.
That specific date being the 100th anniversary of Mao Zedong coming to power. So we're going to focus today on all the author's key points, the details he lays out, especially how this strategy supposedly relies on deception, patience, a lot of patience, and what Pillsbury calls understanding the rules of the game.
Okay, so where do we start? Pillsbury really emphasizes history, specifically China's narrative of this century of humiliation.
Ah, yes, that comes up a lot.
It does, and he argues it's constantly reinforced, in education by leaders, this idea of China as a helpless victim of Western powers, starting way back with the First Opium War in 1839.
It's a potent narrative, and it climaxes, in their telling, with Mao's victory in 1949. You see it reflected physically, too, like on the monument to the people's heroes.
Exactly, and Pillsbury even talks about his own experience back in '67, being taught this narrative, feeling this almost inherited guilt, like his generation needed to atone for what the West did.
So how does that victim narrative, in Pillsbury's view, connect to today's strategy?
Well, he argues it provides a kind of constant justification. It lets China frame its actions as just catching up or, righting historical wrongs rather than actively seeking dominance. And this mindset, he says, leads them straight back to strategic ideas from the Warring States, period.
Way back. 475 to 221 BC, a brutal time.
Extremely brutal.
Yeah.
And Pillsbury insists that's the wellspring for their grand strategy, not Western political thought. And a key concept from that era is SHI.
Right. Pillsbury describes it as understanding the potential energy of a situation, the strategic landscape.
Yeah, it's about seeing the underlying trends, the opportunities, not just reacting, but harnessing the flow of events. He uses some interesting analogies like the Force from Star Wars, not mystically, but as seeing the currents.
Or like Tom Sawyer getting his friends to paint the fence for him.
Exactly, that captures it perfectly. Getting others to act in ways that benefit you, maybe without them even realizing it, which leads directly to another concept, wu wei.
Wu wei, often translated as non-action, but that's misleading here, isn't it?
Very misleading in this context. Strategically, Pillsbury says, it means getting others to do your work. His prime example is Deng Xiaoping in 1978, focusing laser-like on getting science and technology from the U.S.
Because Deng saw technology as the key driver for growth.
Precisely. Number one productive force, he called it. The insight, Pillsbury argues, was that China didn't have to invent everything itself. It could leverage America's advancements, sort of outsource its R&D, accelerate its own rise using American resources.
Okay, that's fascinating. Now, one of Pillsbury's really bombshell claims involves the word ba, B-A.
Yes, this is crucial to his argument about misunderstanding. He says when Chinese leaders like Zhou Enlai called the U.S. a ba, American translators, including Kissinger's, heard leader.
But that wasn't the real meaning, not from the Warring States context.
Not at all. Historically, ba meant something much harsher, a hegemon, a dominant power, even a tyrant who uses force to crush rivals and is eventually overthrown by force. It implies inevitable conflict, not partnership.
So a complete mistranslation with huge implications.
Pillsbury argues it's shaped U.S. policy for decades, led America to see China as a potential partner, missing the signs, he says, that China viewed the U.S. as the hegemon to be eventually replaced, a fundamental misunderstanding of their strategic language.
And this connects to another piece of ancient wisdom he highlights. Never ask the weight of the emperor's cauldrons. What's that about?
It's a lesson in strategic deception. A rising power must hide its true strength and ambition from the dominant power until it's too late for the dominant power to stop them. Don't reveal your intentions until you're strong enough.
Concealment is key.
Absolutely. He tells that story from the Warring States period about Liu Bei and Cao Cao. Liu Bei is secretly plotting against the powerful Cao Cao. Cao Cao summons him, maybe suspects something, and says, you and I are the only real heroes left.
A dangerous moment for Liu Bei.
Extremely. He has to hide his ambition. So Pillsbury recounts. Liu Bei pretends to be utterly shocked, drops his chopsticks, and just then, conveniently, thunder crashes outside. He uses the thunder as an excuse for his reaction, feigning fear of the storm, not Cao Cao's insight. Perfect deception.
Wow. That really drives home how deep this idea of strategic deception runs, according to Pillsbury. So, who are the people actually driving this long-term strategy today? He talks about the Ying Pei hawks.
Right, the Yang Pei. These are military figures, but they're deeply involved in civilian strategic planning in China. Pillsbury points out how different this is from the U.S. You wouldn't have generals deciding tax policy or family planning here.
But in China,
He gives examples. The first foreign minister was a general. The decision to open up to the U.S. came from a committee of 4 generals, the one-child policy, developed by a weapons designer. Key metrics for this marathon strategy. A military writer. Grand strategy books, often from the Academy of Military Sciences.
so a much bigger military influence on overall state strategy than we might assume.
And crucially, he says these figures, once seen as maybe fringe hyper-nationalists, their views became the mainstream party line, especially after the Tiananmen Square crackdown in 1989.
Which brings us to the modern framing, Xi Jinping's China dream.
Yes. And Pillsbury notes how unusual it is for a top Chinese leader to use such, well, emotional language. They usually stick to more bureaucratic phrasing.
But Xi embraces this strong nation dream. Why?
Pillsbury sees it as a clear signal of ambition, openly stated, and the target date for achieving this dream, 2049, exactly 100 years after the founding of the PRC, reinforcing that 100-year marathon idea.
Okay, so that's the historical grounding, the core concepts, the architects, and the vision. How does Pillsbury argue this marathon is actually being run, particularly economically? He really pushes back against the idea that China is just becoming a Western-style market economy.
He absolutely does. He argues China's growth isn't mainly from free market reforms, but from deliberately propping up and subsidizing state-owned enterprises' SOEs. These national champions, he says, still make up a huge chunk of the economy, maybe 40% of GDP.
Their purpose isn't just economic.
No, strategically, he argues, they're designed to undercut Western companies on the global stage. And he makes this startling claim that even institutions like the World Bank, maybe unintentionally, helped China maintain this system
How so?
by advising on things like partial privatization and setting up stock exchanges for SOEs. Pillsbury says China took this advice but used it to strengthen state control, essentially saving these dinosaurs, as he puts it, and consolidating their mercantilist, state-led approach, not moving towards a free market.
That's quite a different perspective than usually presented. Why would China stick with these SOEs, according to Pillsbury?
He lists several reasons. 1, they delivered economic results, which helps justify the party's rule. 2, national security. 3, party-controlled and patronage jobs and influence. 4, pushing for indigenous innovation. And 5, crucially, avoiding what happened in Russia after the Soviet collapse, the chaotic, sometimes corrupt privatization. They learned from that.
And who oversees all this economic strategy?
A key player is the NDRC, the National Development and Reform Commission. Pillsbury describes it as the super agency controlling strategic industries, setting prices, directing investment. He argues its powers often violate WTO rules, using things like non-tariff barriers and exempting SOEs from anti-monopoly laws.
Beyond the SOEs, what other economic tactics does he highlight?
A massive one is intellectual property theft and cyber espionage. He calls it a core component of their growth strategy, not an accident, but policy.
What kind of scale are we talking about?
Huge scale. He cites estimates of tens of thousands employed just in counterfeiting operations. Billions, maybe over $100 billion annually, lost in U.S. sales. Millions of U.S. jobs potentially lost due to IP theft. He labels China the world's most active and persistent perpetrator of economic espionage, using both old-school spies and cyber attacks.
Mentions the Dongfan Chung case.
Yeah, the engineer caught with, 250,000 pages of sensitive aerospace documents, stuff that could fit on one CD. It illustrates the sheer volume thereafter.
So economic pressure, theft. How did they manage the narrative around all this, both inside China and outside?
Through a massive, centrally controlled propaganda system, overseas propaganda work. Launched formally around 2009, he says, with a budget in the billions.
Billions just on propaganda.
Annually, yes. Controlled right from the top, the Politburo Standing Committee and the United Front Work Department. The goal is to shape how foreigners see China, but it starts with controlling the message inside China. Constant monitoring, silencing critics.
He gives some examples of the censorship, right?
Yeah, like how June 4th, the anniversary of Tiananmen Square, is jokingly called Internet Maintenance Day because so much gets blocked. Even seemingly silly things, like banning images of big yellow ducks when people use them online to subtly refer to the Tank Man photo. It shows how tight the control is.
And what about influencing opinions outside China? He talks about cultivating allies.
Yes, he uses the term red team members. Americans, often academics or former officials who are familiar with China, and he argues, become useful assistants in China's public relations. They might get special access, invitations, benefits.
And those who don't play ball.
He gives the example of Perry Link, a respected scholar denied entry to China for nearly 2 decades, Pillsbury says, simply because he wouldn't stick to Beijing's preferred narratives. He also points out how China uses specific code words in international communication, like always saying cross-strait relations, instead of anything acknowledging Taiwan's separate status, which subtly shapes understanding in the West.
Okay, so economic strategy, information control. What about the military side? This is where the assassin's mace concept comes in. Sounds ominous.
It does. It's based on an old Chinese legend about a hero using a secret, maybe unassuming weapon, like a lightweight spiked club, to defeat a much stronger opponent by striking a weak point unexpectedly.
And in modern terms.
Pillsbury says it refers to a suite of asymmetric weapons. Things that are less expensive, developed in secret, and designed to be used at a critical moment to cause shock, confusion, paralysis, defeating a technologically superior adversary, like the U.S., without a direct head-on fight.
And he claims this isn't just theory. He mentions war games.
Yes, this is one of his most startling points. He says, Pentagon war games simulating conflict with China had consistent results. When the China team used conventional forces, the U.S. team typically won. But when the China team employed these assassin's mace strategies,
China won.
Every single time, according to Pillsbury's account of these simulations, he claims this realization was a major driver behind the Obama administration's strategic pivot to Asia.
That's quite alarming, if true. How does this fit with China seemingly avoiding a massive, overt military buildup like the Soviet Union did?
Pillsbury argues that's exactly the point. They learned from the Soviets. They saw that trying to match the U.S. tank for tank, ship for ship, bankrupted the USSR. That was a lethal mistake. So China avoids provoking the hegemon, the U.S., prematurely with a transparent arms race. The assassin's mace lets them develop potentially decisive capabilities more quietly.
This all paints a picture of long-term, calculated deception. Pillsbury also revisits key historical moments where he thinks the West, including himself, got China wrong. Tiananmen Square in 1989 is a big one.
Huge. The West largely saw it, hoped it was, a blip on the road to democracy. A tragedy, yes, but maybe a catalyst for reform eventually.
But Pillsbury argues that wasn't how China's leaders saw it, or how it played out internally.
No. He describes the brutality, the tanks, the bullets designed to expand, soldiers attacking protesters. But he also admits he and many others were gullible. They thought it was a temporary setback. Meanwhile, the reformers inside China were being jailed or forced into exile.
And Deng Xiaoping's takeaway.
According to Pillsbury, Deng became convinced the protests weren't spontaneous, but a U.S. orchestrated psychological operation designed to bring down the Communist Party. This fueled deep anti-American paranoia.
He compares this to other intelligence failures.
Yeah, like the U.S. being surprised by China entering the Korean War or Soviet missiles in Cuba. He argues it's a pattern of underestimating or misinterpreting the intentions of adversaries, and warnings from defectors after Tiananmen about China's hardening stance were largely ignored.
Then came the collapse of the Soviet Union in '91, a moment of triumph for the West. How did Beijing rate it?
Completely differently. Pillsbury says they saw it as proof of America's strategy to undermine communist states, America's first great offensive, designed to sow discord. It terrified them.
And the result inside China?
A purge of remaining pro-American officials and thinkers, he claims. And the creation of this detailed alternate history portraying the U.S. not as a partner or even just a rival, but as an evil twin, constantly working to destabilize China.
Yet, U.S. policy didn't dramatically shift.
It shifted, but slowly, maybe cautiously. Pillsbury mentions President George H.W. Bush getting advice, supposedly from Nixon, to basically keep the relationship going, take a look at the long haul, don't disrupt things too much, despite Tiananmen and the Soviet collapse narrative.
Another key incident Pillsbury flags is the accidental NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999. During the Kosovo conflict.
Right. A tragic mistake. 3 Chinese journalists killed. But in Beijing, Pillsbury argues it wasn't seen as an accident.
They saw it as deliberate.
Or at least it became politically useful to portray it that way. It became an irresistible rallying cry for anti-Americanism, perfectly fitting the narrative the hawks were already pushing. It confirmed their view of U.S. intentions.
And this coincides with China becoming more assertive.
Yes, Pillsbury connects this period, and especially the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, which weakened the West, to China feeling that strategic momentum had shifted in their favor. They started pushing back more openly, protesting arms sales to Taiwan, declaring that air defense identification zone, they felt their time was coming.
It seems like there were signs, according to Pillsbury. He mentions Lee Kuan Yew, the former leader of Singapore, as someone who saw it coming.
Definitely. Lee Kuan Yew was widely respected for his insights on Asia, and Pillsbury says Lee's advice to China itself was basically the ancient strategy. Hide your strength, bide your time, keep your head down until you're ready.
But the West didn't really listen to Lee's warnings about China's long-term goals.
Largely ignored, Pillsbury contends. Why? He puts it down to wishful thinking in the West, combined with China being very good at playing the humble, non-threatening role for decades. Lee's sobering forecast, as Pillsbury calls it, just didn't fit the preferred narrative of China inevitably integrating peacefully.
So, if Pillsbury's analysis is correct, or even partially correct, what's the path forward? He makes a pretty startling claim about U.S. aid to China.
Yeah, he points out the uncomfortable fact that over the years, a significant amount of U.S. taxpayer money, maybe a small fortune, has actually gone towards helping China's rise. Often kept quiet, low profile. He gives examples. U.S. Labor Department experts helping Chinese factories boost productivity. U.S. treasuries helping their banking sector. FAA helping their aircraft manufacturers compete with Boeing. Things presented as technical assistance or engagement.
And Pillsbury himself admits he was part of this mindset for a long time.
He does. He talks about his own gullibility and how slow U.S. officials were to see the shift, often dismissing defectors' warnings. He calls it a third intellectual trap. The long history of U.S.-China cooperation, sometimes even covert cooperation against the Soviets, prejudiced officials towards seeing China as a partner, even when the evidence, he argues, pointed towards rivalry.
So waking up to this reality, what does he recommend the U.S. do? He talks about needing a grand coalition inside the U.S. first.
Right. His idea is that different groups in America who have grievances with China, maybe human rights groups, businesses suffering from IP theft, defense hawks worried about military expansion, even groups concerned about things like abortion policy in China, they need to find common ground, unite around a shared mission to push for real change in China and change U.S. policy from its old assumptions.
An internal alignment before looking outward and externally.
He proposes a vertical coalition, basically encouraging China's neighbors, think Mongolia, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, India, to work together more closely, to form alliances to counterbalance China's influence. He likens it to the strategy in the game Go, where you try to encircle your opponent. China, he says, really fears being encircled by its neighbors.
And financially, given China's massive propaganda budget.
He highlights the huge disparity. China spending billions on shaping narratives overseas, while the U.S. spends, he estimates, less than $50 million a year on actual democracy promotion within China. He argues for a massive increase in funding to support rule of law, civil society, maybe even free market reformers inside China if they can be found and supported.
It really boils down to seeing the relationship through a completely different lens, doesn't it?
That's the core message. Pillsbury argues China's hawks see everything the U.S. does, aid programs, trade deals, military patrols, democracy promotion, as a move on that strategic game board, part of an effort to contain or encircle China. The U.S., he says, needs to recognize that's the game being played, instead of operating under illusions of partnership.
So to recap, we've journeyed through Michael Pillsbury's argument in the 100-Year Marathon. This idea of a deliberate, deeply rooted strategy of deception, patience, using ancient concepts all aimed at replacing the U.S. by 2049. We've looked to the economic tactics, the propaganda, the asymmetric military concepts, the historical turning points he identifies.
And the profound misunderstandings, particularly around terms like Ba, that he believes have shaped Western policy for far too long. It's a challenging perspective, certainly.
It really is. And perhaps the most provocative thought to leave you with is reflecting on Pillsbury's own journey, his admission of being gullible, and his assertion that the U.S. government largely remains caught in outdated perceptions. What if he's right? What if, for decades, America has been playing a strategic game without fully grasping the rules, or even that the game had truly begun? What does it mean if one side is playing a long game with immense patience and deception, while the other operates on assumptions of transparency and eventual convergence.
It raises fundamental questions, not just about military or economic competition, but about a clash of worldviews, of strategic cultures, one steeped in millennia of statecraft emphasizing concealment, the other perhaps valuing openness.
What's the real cost of not seeing clearly, of intellectual complacency when the stakes are this high?